The Protestant Reformation is a major movement in this world that every one of us that claims Messiah, but also rejects the doctrines of Rome, have been influenced by. As we seek to come closer to Yahuwah, I understand that it is hard to really break free from the foundational structures of religion that we have come to know of, because of the mere scope and size of the influence can often intimidate you. You can often have feelings like, there's no way that people could be wrong for so many years in this way. But then you go back to the scriptures and remember that it is prophesied that Satan deceives the whole world. So doctrines and understandings that a majority of the world holds up as truth is more than likely propped up by a lie. The Protestant Reformation is a big deal because it is how we all have been influenced into the religion of Christianity. Wherever you are in this world, if you're not a part of the Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox Church and you are attached to the Protestant Church, you have been influenced by this movement. And as I have been saying since the beginning of this series, for this to be such an important subject that so many of us have been influenced by, it is really something that a majority of us don't have a strong understanding of the events of this movement and exactly what changed, especially with the enormous amount of writings Martin Luther has done. For a population which has all these Protestant churches in every city around the world, while also a population with a structured education system, a topic like the Protestant Reformation that changed the world should be one that is surrounded by strong understanding. But unfortunately, it is not. So as we, those who truly love Yahuwah and are preparing for his kingdom to come, as we break off the shackles of falsehoods and we come to worship him in spirit and in truth, we find that this subject about the history of the Reformation with Martin Luther being explained, it brings much clarity and conviction as we are desiring a more truthful relationship with Yah based upon his word and less upon religious doctrines and traditions of men. So we went through the first 3 parts of this history about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. But in order to move on with our understanding, we must bring this topic to a close. We need to move on to what happened after the Protestant Reformation and how we got to all these different denominations. So in order to close this discussion, we must speak about what happened after Luther's famous words at the Diet of Worms and understand the final story and overall influence of Martin Luther. This video will conclude this part in the series about the hijacking that occurred due to the Protestant Reformation. Let's begin. They all follow replacement theology and falsely believe that they have replaced Israel. The one last influence I will mention in regards to Luther is his influence on the canon of Scripture. So many people love speaking against the Apocrypha, but they don't recognize that they are just influenced by Luther. The canon of the Bible accepted by Catholics contain 46 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. The canon accepted by Protestants usually contains 7 less books following the lead of Martin Luther. The following are the books rejected by Luther: Tobias, Baruch, Judith, Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Luther rejected these books. His basis of reasoning was, what authority from God would Jews have in the Christian era to determine which books of the Old Testament were or were not divinely inspired? So let's be clear. The term apocryphal had been used since the 5th century, but it was in Luther's Bible of 1534 that the Apocrypha was first published as a separate intertestamental section. He did not exclude the Apocrypha, but he simply placed them between the Old Testament and the New Testament, terming these as Apocrypha. In the Lutheran tradition, the Apocrypha are non-canonical but worthy of reverence. He considered them not to be equal to the Holy Scriptures, but are useful and good to read. And later on, this influence was followed even more as we get to King James. This man, Martin Luther, he is the man who has determined how most of you accept the Apocrypha. A Gentile man with a false foundation that comes from Rome has determined these books are not equal to Scripture. And to also add to this, Luther's problem with the Bible, it wasn't only limited to the Old Testament. His attitude toward certain New Testament books is also shocking. He almost threw out the Epistle of James, which he called an epistle of straw with no character of the gospel in it. This is because he was lawless. He also dishonored Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation, declaring that they were not on the same footing as the rest of the books of the Bible. His feeling was, where does the Bible teach that? Luther placed all 4 of these books and an appendix to his German translation of the Bible. This is the man who has a major influence over Christianity without us even knowing it. Me personally, I refuse to be influenced by him and his movement. I think this is important to understand when we understand this Protestant movement and Martin Luther. Let's finish up with him and the history. So the reason why he was able to have all these doctrinal challenges and debates was because he eventually left from exile. He was eventually able to return home to Wittenberg. After he returned home, he married a former nun who turned Protestant, and then they had children. Because the Reformation had spread and other beliefs began to spring up, Emperor Charles held an imperial diet in the city of Augsburg on April 8th in the year 1530. He allowed all the other Protestants who were technically outlaws to attend. Martin Luther was not allowed to actually attend though, so he came as close as he could, but was not in actual attendance. His followers were still there though, so his influence was still felt. With the emperor in attendance, this diet might serve as something like a church council, where ecclesiastical matters and doctrinal differences were debated and resolved. This was something the Pope at the time, Pope Clement, deeply resented. The very idea of an emperor meddling in such things was to him a very clear case of imperial state overreach in the affairs of the church. But the lines between what constituted church and state were very fuzzy at that time. At the Diet, the Lutherans presented a statement of faith listing items they were unwavering on and that differed from the Roman Church's teachings. This included marriage of the clergy, rejection of the idea of the Mass as a sacrifice, the Lord's Supper in both kinds, bread and wine to everyone, and the end of monastic communities. It's known as the Augsburg Confession, also known as the Augustine Confession. It is the primary confession of faith of the Lutheran Church and one of the most important documents of the Protestant Reformation. This is a list of the 28 confessions of the faith. So I can make a point, let's talk about the topic about the last days. Let's go to Article 17 of Christ's return to judgment. Lutherans believe that Christ will return to raise the dead and judge the world. The godly will be given everlasting joy, and the ungodly will be tormented without end. The article rejects notions of a millennial kingdom before the resurrection of the dead. If you read through this, nothing about this faith even mentions Israel. Nothing about Israel and Judah being joined back to one another. It's all about going to heaven or hell, and this is what the Protestant church was built from. This is the foundation that it expanded from. The Augsburg Confession became the primary confessional document for the Lutheran movement, and they formed a military alliance of Lutheran princes within the Holy Roman Empire, known as the Schmalkaldic League. They formed this league with the intention that the league will replace the Holy Roman Empire as their focus of political allegiance. This would be their new government. The league admitted anyone who was subscribed to the Augsburg Confession and became a Lutheran. They basically formed a military alliance to fight against the Holy Roman Empire. Eventually, they later fought a war known as the Schmalkaldic War, but they did not win. Emperor Charles seemed to have won the battle against the Protestants. Protestant Germany no longer existed on the maps, and so the emperor thought he had beaten the Protestant movement. But by this time, Luther's ideas had spread too wide and sunk too deep into the lives of too many people. The Reformation was not defeated because the ideas of Luther was still very much alive and they spread across Europe. In fact, many of the princes and key reformers that were a part of the Schmalkaldic League, such as Martin Bucer, him among others who was exiled to England after the loss of the Schmalkaldic War, they directly influenced the English Reformation. And it's from this history where the Christian faith that is in America and in Africa that was spread through the Empire England gets its start. We will get to it, Yah willing. Okay, so though the emperor won the battle against the Protestants, he lost the war. There was resistance and then more resistance until in the year 1555, the emperor was forced to accept the Protestant territories. He signed the Peace of Augsburg Treaty, also called the Augsburg Settlement, formally granting status to the Protestant territories, and from this, Europe never will be a united Catholic territory again. It officially ended the religious struggle between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, and made the legal division of Christianity permanent within the Holy Roman Empire. It allowed rulers to choose either Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism as the official confession of their state. Calvinism was not allowed until the Peace of Westphalia Treaty in 1648 was signed. Charles V abdicated his throne a year later, and this is how the Protestants became accepted in Europe away from the Roman Catholic Church. And that's the story in the history of the Protestant movement. To summarize Martin Luther and his effect, let's say this. The Roman Catholic Church, before Luther, had nearly infinite power and authority, and then after Luther, that all changed. Luther opened the door to many direct challenges to the Roman Church. How it might be framed in the mainstream is that he opened the door to a second church, what we call the Lutheran Church. But what he really did was open the door to an infinite number of churches. When you only look at the movement in a way that takes power away from Rome, it can be looked at in a positive view. But when you actually understand what came about from this movement, it looks a lot different. You see, once the Pope and the Church's authority were openly challenged, lies and confusion were now able to be given a free hearing with the truth. There was no more truth, just a lot of opinions that brought forth many different doctrines that spurred many new, what we now call, denominations. Once Luther's influence took hold, there was nothing stopping any fool or perhaps any person with sinister goals against Yahuwah to establish their own interpretation of things and create their own religion and deceive millions, leading them all to hell. And as we go through the histories, you'll see that in the centuries that follow Martin Luther, this is precisely what happens. What in fact happened was that through the Protestant movement, though it's labeled as simply protesting against the church, it's more about protesting against truth. If you had a rational argument, you could pose it, and this now could be truth. And it spurred the beginning to the revolution that Freemasonry would take the reins of a couple centuries after. Once Luther sided with the view of the Bible that was different from Rome's, our modern idea of freedom was born. All of the major changes of history that influence our modern world follows after this movement and was inspired or influenced by this movement. First, there was a bunch of new churches that were started. The Reformation spread beyond Germany to England and to many other countries in Europe. England is the most important one because this is what we in America are influenced and controlled by, as I have repeatedly said. But after the growth of the new churches, this idea of freedom grew into something else. It turned into a new way of seeing things. To understand it, look at what happened shortly after. In 1644, in the midst of the English Civil War, John Milton published Areopagitica, a landmark defense of the freedom of speech and expression inspired by the struggles of the Protestant movement, inspired by Luther. In 1689, England decided that it would tolerate religions other than the established Church of England. In the first 10 years of the 17th century, men and women we call pilgrims were being persecuted by King James, and they fled to Holland and then crossed the Atlantic to Massachusetts, all in the pursuit of carrying out their religious beliefs. In the beginning of the 18th century, the secret society of Freemasonry comes out into public view in England. This was all inspired by the protests Martin Luther started against Rome. During the Great Awakening of the 18th century, George Whitefield preached the Christian gospel up and down the 13 colonies so often that by the time of his death in 1770, not less than 80% of all Americans had heard him preach in person at least once. He preached a Christianity that underscored Lutherans' ideas of being more devoted to God than to any church or government. So it followed that those who did violence to the teachings of Jesus, they must be disobeyed. And so this played a huge role in emboldening the American colonists to move towards self-government, because when England forced its hand, as Rome had forced Luther's, they revolted against their mother country, just as Luther had rebelled against his mother church. Luther's rebellion was the basis for change that we live in this world through. The new nation of America was born in 1776, enshrined in the idea of religious liberty and its laws, such that every citizen must be free to follow his own conscience and his own religion. All of this is said to be influenced from the legacy of Luther and the Protestant Reformation. You got to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about protesting against Rome, but it was protesting for what they wanted. And when then you also add the influence from the mental and the social shifts that happened during the Renaissance that also took hold during the Reformation, influence like humanism, we can see the protest was about freedom. It wasn't about Yahuwah. And so later on, from Luther's legacy, others would then take steps further, and through Freemasonry, these ideas really took on a life of its own. And if you research, they credit Luther's protest and his ideas as the beginning ideas that spurred the new nation of America. Don't ever forget that this American Revolution was fought by Freemasons from Masonic principles. What I'm trying to explain is that the Protestant movement was less about putting the Most High first, but more about putting the thoughts and minds of the people first, and it began a mental idea that transformed the world. It was the spark of an idea that you can protest against the powers and authorities of this world, and eventually, through this protest, we all will make this world a better place, a Christian world. This is the Protestant Reformation. You have now been given a 4-part history lesson that has given you an in-depth history on how the Protestant Christian world was started. But we do have a long way to go in the history. And so the summary of this, and what I need you to understand, is that most of the Christian church today have received their doctrines of Christianity from the foundation that Roman Catholicism laid. Rome was the beginning, and men like Luther took this false foundation and created more doctrines that have led the Christian world into division. And this division probably will not be brought into unity until the satanic agenda has arrived that men like Albert Pike have said they have a plan for. He said those disillusioned with Christianity will be lost and they be guided into their false utopia. And it's all because the foundation of our faith was off and our true biblical faith was hijacked. And instead of breaking away, people use their indoctrinated lessons from their church in order to validate their actions. The point I am making to you is that if you're trying to get closer to Messiah and be ready for him, you must identify the falsehoods and deceptions. Romans chapter 16 verses 17 and 18 urge us to note those who cause divisions and offenses, contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them. For those who are such do not serve our Adon Yahusha the Messiah, but their own belly, and by smooth words and flattering speech deceive the hearts of the simple. It's time that you recognize where your doctrines come from and why you do certain things. Let's be clear, for the most part, one-liners in scriptures are not justifications for full doctrine. The Hebrews had a culture and a way, and it was taught about many times in the scriptures. Yes, Yahusha brought clarity and explained many other things and showed us that it was all about what was in our heart. But he did not change the way of the Hebrews. The hijackers did, and this is why the Christian faith does not resemble the faith of the Hebrews at all. This is why the Christian faith does not observe most of the commands in the Old Testament. If you are a self-declared Christian, you have been directed by a foundation of the universal church, and you do not have to share all their doctrines and beliefs in order to be steered away from Yahuwah. The universal church hijacked the authority and made themselves the holders of Yah's covenant, and they conquered the world through this false authority. It's time to identify doctrines that have been taught by our enemy and remove them, and live a life of faith more intertwined with the scriptures and less intertwined with the traditions of men. As you can clearly see now, the influence of the Protestant Reformation is massive. But because many of us are not Lutherans, this information probably does not hit close enough to home yet. That's why we have more to speak on. Right now, you are just being educated on the falsehoods so that as we continue to break bondage and layers, these things can start becoming much more clear. What I ask is, while Yahuwah provides this clarity and directs me as to where this information leads next, please take time daily and read the scriptures for yourself and align yourself with Yahuwah and drop all the false ideals and the traditions of men. I pray that you heed this advice and let Yahuwah set you free. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please do not forget to like it and share this video with others. If you have not done so already, please do not forget to subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Also, please do not forget to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. As always, I'd like to thank all of you who support this ministry. Thank you. Your contributions truly bless this ministry, and I'm thankful and humbled by your support. Thank you for being a blessing and letting Yah lead your heart. Be blessed.